My Lord Honorable Mr. Justice Katju, Mr. Sidharth Vardharajan, Professor Haragopal, Mr. Rao, Major Qadri, other distinguished guests in the audience. Indian media, by and large, is free, objective, and I say with some amount of confidence, friend of minority. In fact, they led minorities' battle against Modi. It's a different story, though Sidharth doesn't agree with me, that lately it seems that media has accepted Modi as the next Prime Minister of the country. We also have a grievance that at times this friendly media does not fully understand our issues. And I'll quickly pick up a case in point. When Aligarh Muslim University came up with Muslim reservation, all newspapers said ghettoization, this and that. It was not a reservation solely based on religion. It was a minority institution where they were talking of reservation. It was not Article 15 reservation, it was Article 30 reservation. In fact, Aligarh's reservation policy was a unique reservation policy in the history of affirmative action world over. Because as against the institutional reservation, where less meritorious people were getting admissions, they said that we want to have reservation for Muslims of India, but media did not understand it at that point of time. In India, the terror reporting by media is no different from the Western media, with of course exceptions of papers like Hindu. And His Lordship Justice Katju has been nation's conscience keeper and has issued any number of statements on media reporting of terror and how judgmental media becomes while reporting terror. And in His Lordship's presence, I should not be speaking too much on this subject. Similarly, Sidharth is the right person to talk on behalf of media on terror reporting. But what I propose to do and say that media is highly sensitive in terror reporting. But sensitive to what? Sensitive to their own ratings and circulation. And equally sensitive to the needs of terrorists. If it is insensitive, it is to the people who are innocent victims of terror incident or innocent victims of prompt police action and police conclusions about the people who were behind the acts of terror. Therefore, before any court of law can find them guilty, media would pronounce its verdict. This morning I propose to do is just to flag few issues about media-terror relationship. My main thesis is that not only media unnecessarily drags Muslims as soon as any terror incident takes place, and you would listen His Lordship on this. This is something which is so deplorable to say the least, but basically media promotes terrorism and aids terrorists. And my second point is at times media violates privacy of victims. And my third point is that media reporting of terror adversely affects our psychology, which is, I think, the biggest issue, and with which I would conclude, and do at times exploit suffering of victims, which indeed to me is the worst and most painful part of media reporting of terror. Terrorism's efficacy, like beauty, is in the eyes of the beholder, in that those who commit political violence deliberately directed against civilians believe in the success of their deeds. In one respect, most if not all terrorists do achieve an important goal. Whenever they strike, especially if they stage so-called terrorist spectaculars, their deeds assure them massive news coverage and the attention of general public and governmental decision makers in their particular target societies. Moreover, given the global nature of the communication system, the perpetrators of international and domestic terrorism also tap into the international media and thereby receive the attention of public and governments beyond their immediate target countries. Former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher once said that publicity is the oxygen of terrorism. Without publicity, terrorism would be like the proverbial tree that falls in the forest and the press is not there to report it, and would be as if the incident never happened. As television technology advanced further and competition among TV, radio and print organizations became fiercer, the media became more obsessed with exploiting violence as crime and violence as terrorism in search of higher TRP ratings and circulation. As a result, the contemporary news media, especially television, have customarily devoted huge chunks of their broadcast time and news columns to major and minor acts of political violence, supporting the media's critics' argument that mass media, as unwitting as they are, facilitate the media-centered terrorist scheme. In the past, media critics have documented and questioned the mass media's insatiable appetite for violence. They have explored the effects of this kind of media content on people who are regularly exposed to violence in the news and in entertainment. While violence as crime and violence as terrorism tend to be grossly overreported, the coverage of terrorist incidents that provide dramatic visuals is in the league of its own in terms of media attention. With few exceptions here and there, ordinary criminals do not commit their deeds to attract cameras, microphones, and reporters' notebooks. But for terrorists, publicity is the lifeblood and their oxygen. No other medium has provided more oxygen to terrorism than television because of its ability to report the news instantly, non-stop, and in visuals and words from any place to any parts of the globe, a facility that has affected the reporting pattern of other media as well. There was no need to count broadcast minutes or measure column lengths to establish the proportion of total news that dealt with Black Tuesday, 9/11, and its aftermath. For the first 5 days after the terror attack, television and radio networks covered the disaster around the clock without the otherwise obligatory commercial breaks. There simply was no other news. Eventually, one wondered whether terrorism coverage needed to be curtailed so that other important news got the attention it deserved. Newsweek and Time, for example, devoted all cover stories in the 8 weeks following the event of September 11 to terrorism and terror-related themes. There is no doubt that when the terrorists behind the attack on America received the attention of all Americans, the general public and the world leaders alike, this level of media coverage was a perfect achievement as far as attention-getting goal in the United States was concerned. In the 10 weeks following the attack of September 11, Time magazine depicted Osama bin Laden 3 times and President George W. Bush twice on its cover. During the same period, Newsweek carried bin Laden twice on its cover and President Bush not at all. Finally, the cover of Newsweek's 11th issue after September 11 featured President George W. and First Lady Laura Bush. From the terrorist point of view, it did not matter that bin Laden earned bad press in the United States and elsewhere. Singled out, condemned, and warned by leaders such as President Bush and Tony Blair, Osama bin Laden was in the news as frequently as the words legitimate leaders, or even more frequently. This in itself was a smashing success from the perspective of bin Laden and his associates. The mass media therefore reflected that bin Laden and his followers preoccupied not only America and the West, but literally the entire world. Now my second issue, how the victims are reported without any sensitivity. And whatever happens in West has happened in India as well. When the broadcast media played and replayed the recorded exchanges between victims in the World Trade Center and emergency police dispatchers. This recently happened in Dilsukh Nagar as well. They exploited the unimaginable suffering of those who were trapped and soon died in the struck towers, criticizing this practice as prime time pornography. One commentator wrote, and I quote, "Can there be anybody on the planet who failed to immediately grasp the full horror of what went on September 11, that they need to hear over and over the emotional mayhem of ordinary people trying to cope amidst overwhelming disbelief, fear, and terror, not to mention grief. But in our show and tell culture, there is nothing so private and sensitive that it cannot be exposed and sensationalized, especially where ratings are involved. One can perfectly agree with this insistence on journalistic ethics, as I do, and still wonder whether the show and tell culture has not only desensitized broadcasters, but also confuse the public's distinction between private and public sphere. One political columnist identified the greatest danger of journalism, and I quote, "Our new obsession with terrorism will make us its unwitting accomplices. We will become and have already partly become merchants of fear." And I will conclude with this theme. Now, terrorism and media are not bedfellows. They are more like partners in a marriage of convenience, in that terrorists need all the news coverage they can get, and media need dramatic, shocking, sensational, tragic events to sustain and bolster their TRP ratings or circulation. There is no doubt that the most fundamental responsibility of a free press is to inform the public of events and issues in order for citizens to make informed judgments and decisions. Therefore, it would be absurd to suggest that there should be no reporting on terrorism. This is not my case. Government censorship is not acceptable option either. At issue is how to report on this kind of political violence in ways that are less accommodating to terrorists' mass-mediated goals and less likely to curtail the watchdog role of press that is essential for a healthy democracy. We need to emphasize the symbiotic relationship between terrorism and media. Terrorist attacks are a particular form of communication by terrorist group. The media is used as a platform for securing a broad dissemination of terrorist ideology. The media benefit from terrorism, as reports of terror attack increase newspaper sales and number of television viewers. There is a common interest game whereby both the media and terrorists benefit from terrorist incidents, and where both parties adjust their actions according to the actions of other players. Let us quickly talk of Indian media, specifically on terror reporting. I'll just pick up one or two incidents and that's it. It is not just the lowly vernacular media, as many are given to believe, but even the respectable mainstream national English language press in India that have sedulously cultivated the notion of Islamic terrorism. So much so that the image of Muslims in general being either terrorist or their sympathizer enjoys white currency today. While it is true that some of most disorderly terror attacks that India has witnessed in recent years have been the handiwork of some Muslims, and this is something that the vast majority of Indian Muslims themselves deplore. It is also undeniable that Muslims have been unfairly blamed for many other attacks or alleged terror plots by the police as well as media in which they had no role to play at all. Many Muslims and others to believe that these false allegations are not innocent errors, but can be said to represent deliberate and concerted efforts to defame and demonize the entire community and religion with which it is associated. And we know the column 9 report about Karnataka, where they looked at the vernacular press and the English press also to find out number of cases where, the material was in Urdu, therefore it must be the jihadi literature. And similarly, they will pick up a picture of some dargah and say that there was some Pakistani flag. And number of journalists admitted in this report that 60% of whatever reports they gave were false. I would conclude by saying simply this, that media should deal with moral questions. Media could make clear that for breaking a law on moral grounds to be justifiable, the moral position appealed to must be sound and justifiable. The result of current terror reporting, about which you would be listening, His Lordship, the perverse result is that we may become the terrorists' silent allies. Terrorism is not just about death and destruction. It's also about creating fear, sowing suspicion, undermining confidence in public leadership, provoking people and government into doing things that they might not otherwise do. It is an assault as much on our psychology as on our bodies. Thank you very much.